Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from across the world today on another episode of Pandemic Punditry brought to you by the Content Experience Company. We are delighted and honored to have with us Dr. Neal Bernard, an Adjunct Associate Professor of Medicine at the George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., and President of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Dr. Bernard has led numerous research studies investigating the effects of diet on diabetes, body weight, and chronic pain, including a groundbreaking study of dietary interventions in type 2 diabetes funded by the National Institutes of Health. That paved the way for viewing type 2 diabetes as a potentially reversible condition for many patients. Dr. Bernard has authored more than 100 scientific publications and 20 books for medical and lay readers, and is the editor-in-chief of the Nutrition Guide for Clinicians, a textbook made available to all U.S. medical students. His research contributed to the acceptance of plant-based diets in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and in 2015, he was named a Fellow of the American College of Cardiology, and in 2016, he founded the Barnard Medical Center in Washington, D.C., as a model for making nutrition a routine part of medical care. Welcome to Pandemic Punditry, Dr. Neal Bernard.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today.
I hear that there are lots of fans here in India, where I'm coming to you from, of you and your work. So I think we will have quite a few guest viewers here on our show today. So we're all looking forward to speaking with you.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that on my many.
I understand that most of them are females. So
on my many trips to India, I've met many people who have inspired me a great deal. I'm delighted to be able to try to return the favor.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those of you who are watching today, feel free to sort of send us your questions anytime during this broadcast, and on whatever channel you are watching us today. And time permitting, we will see whether we can get those questions answered. So Dr. Bernard, first of all, let me ask you, you've always maintained that type 2 diabetes is largely reversible with changes in diet and lifestyle. And is this sort of modern medicine's burn our bras moment, in that should diabetics get rid of all their pills and insulin injections?
I think it's a mistake to cancel your next doctor's appointment and to throw your medications away. But hopefully, as time goes on, something like that might be something that could be imagined. What I mean to say is that a person who has diabetes has insulin resistance. And that comes from the buildup of fat in the liver and the muscle cells, and that can be changed rather expeditiously by diet changes. And as a person makes those diet changes, their insulin sensitivity starts to return, their need for medication starts to diminish, and the sooner we get to this sort of healthful diet, the more rapidly the results will occur. And for most people, they're able to reduce their medication use. In some cases, they're able to get off their medications altogether, and there are people, a great many people, who no longer have diabetes for all intents and purposes as a result.
Wow. So it's potentially at that point it's cured, is it? I mean, if they stay with the diet.
Yes, but we mustn't get complacent, because unhealthful foods are waiting right around the corner. And what that means is that if we go back to the foods that cause diabetes in the first place, they can cause it again. But I think the important point is, as you're touching on, diabetes is more of a state that people can get into, and they can, in many cases, get out of it, as opposed to it being a permanent condition. But don't get me wrong, I think you also made a really important point that people should not simply just cancel their doctor's appointment and say, hallelujah, I'm following a healthy diet, I don't need any help anymore. It takes time to get healthier, and different people will have different results as they start to improve their diets.
So is it, I mean, I've heard this, my grandfather was a diabetic, my father was diabetic. So does that mean that it's sort of a preordained genetic sort of predisposition for it? Or is that something that, as you said, a state that you can get into and a state you can get out of?
Well, we do pass genetic traits on to our children, and they in turn pass it on to their children. And there are some hereditary aspects to type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes. That said, we don't just give DNA to our children. We also give them recipes. We give them tastes for certain foods, and those things are much more determinative of who is going to end up with diabetes and who does not. And regardless of one's genetic loading, a dietary change can often have dramatic effects. And by the way, not only for diabetes, but also for things like body weight and our risk of cardiovascular diseases like heart disease or stroke. These are things that where we have more power in our daily choices than we might have imagined. And the role of our genetics is really quite modest for all of these.
Wow. Karthika?
Oh, thanks, Larry. Hi, Dr. Bernard.
Hi.
In your book, Body in Balance, you talk about the impact of our diet on our hormones and endocrine system, right? So can you reverse like hyperthyroidism and other diseases with what you eat?
There are many new intriguing findings with regard to the thyroid. We are not as far advanced in the thyroid research as we are with diabetes research, but what we have found is extremely intriguing. And for people who are wondering what we're talking about, your thyroid is here at the base of your neck, and it makes thyroid hormone, which gives energy to your cells. And some people are low in thyroid hormone. They're not making much of it. And that can often be related to dietary issues. The obvious one is they may not have enough iodine in their diet. That's pretty easy to rectify. And the other is they might be eating foods that are triggering their body to attack the thyroid. They're eating foods that are causing an antibody reaction that is damaging the thyroid. And there are some intriguing findings that suggest that a diet change might be very helpful. But we need more research in this area.
Wow. So that, I mean, you're attacking the thyroid. The food is actually potentially attacking the thyroid, right? Wow, that's a amazing sort of thing.
This really emerged. I want to give a lot of credit to the Adventist Health Study too, where researchers at Loma Linda University brought together a very large group of Adventists. And the reason they picked on Adventists and put them under the microscope was that it's a group of quite health conscious people who vary in diet. They're almost entirely non-smokers, they are teetotalers, but some are vegetarian, some are not, some are vegan, some are more heavy meat eaters. And what they discovered is that whether you looked at hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, the vegans had the least risk of either one. And when it came to hypothyroidism, the people who did the worst actually were lacto-ovo-vegetarians, which was a surprise. They weren't eating meat, but they were making up for it with cheese or dairy products, and that kind of thing. And the people who did the worst with hyperthyroidism were the omnivores. And so that led to we already knew that antibodies were attacking the thyroid in both cases. In hypothyroidism, they're attacking the thyroid's ability to produce thyroid hormone. In the case of hyperthyroidism, the antibodies are attacking in a different way. They're stopping the thyroid from being able to turn off, so to speak. But in either case, it looks like the people who avoid animal products do best. And our theory is that animal protein, whether it's an egg protein or a meat protein or a dairy protein, might trigger the body to create antibodies that in turn then affect the thyroid function. It hasn't been put to randomized trials yet, but in case reports, individuals who have made a switch to get these antigens out of their diet have in some cases remitted, meaning their disease is gone. And I have met many such people, and I think it's very important that this be followed up with a randomized clinical trial.
Wow, that's great news for people with that condition, obviously, and there's quite a lot in the world. Dr. Bernard, you have recently sort of voiced strong objections to the previous Trump administration's executive order to keep meat processing plants open, ostensibly to ensure the continued continued supply of protein for Americans. So, sort of a tongue-in-cheek question here, but are Americans actually protein deficient, and should the USDA do a better job of regulating the meat industry, in your opinion?
When COVID-19 entered the United States, it was in the same way as it entering every other country. It was devastating. And the hotspots were got the thyroid on my head. The hotspots were the slaughterhouses. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, one of the slaughterhouses had more than half the COVID cases in the entire state. They were all occurring in one single building. And it was a pork slaughterhouse owned by Smithfield. And they were shut down, and many other slaughterhouses were shut down. But then the president intervened and said Americans need their pork chops, and tried to push them to reopen. He didn't have the authority to do that, and he should not have encouraged them to open, because they were exporting not just protein, they were exporting a lot of fat and cholesterol, and they were also exporting the SARS-CoV-2 virus, very likely, because what we have found is that the virus survives very well on refrigerated and on frozen meat products. And if you've got a whole lot of COVID-infected people working in your slaughterhouse, you're sending products around to the kitchens elsewhere geographically, there's no call for that whatsoever. But to answer your question directly, no, Americans are not protein deficient, and no one needs animal products for protein. You'll get plenty of protein in beans, lentils, other legumes, vegetables, grains, and there's even a trace in fruit. So protein is not our limiting nutrient at all.
Yeah. No, I think we, as a vegan myself, we constantly get asked that question from people who ostensibly are looking out for our welfare by saying, "Oh, where do you get your protein from?" I mean, you know this. It's a common question that all of us get asked.
Yes, it's one that nutritionists are routinely frustrated by, because it's been clear since the 1950s that it's a very easy matter to get adequate protein. And the problem is that people who eat meat or other animal products in search of protein do themselves great harm, because along with the protein comes animal fat, comes cholesterol, it causes also hormonal changes kick in. And if you look at a person who includes even moderate amounts of animal products in their diet, their risk of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, of weight problems goes up really quite significantly. And so we're best to avoid these things altogether. And as I say this, I have to sort of apologize to my long deceased grandfather, who, like most of the rest of my family, spent his life raising cattle in the Midwest of the United States. And I'm happy to say that my own generation has gotten away from that.
It's interesting that, even today, routinely medical doctors here in India, especially, also feel that, if you're on a vegan diet, and don't have any dairy, that you're somehow highly deficient in protein. I was unfortunately in the ICU about 2 years ago, and the chief dietitian of a major hospital, when she asked what my dietary preferences, and I told her vegan and strictly not more dairy, she goes, "Oh my God, how do you get your protein?" I was astonished, right? So that's how bad it is sometimes among the medical profession. I guess they're 50 years behind in some cases where the literature is concerned, unfortunately. Karthik, I think you had a question for Dr. Bernard.
I did, actually. Dr. Bernard, has the pandemic, I think it's been a year now, especially focusing, our attention on comorbidities, helped, do you think, in your opinion, change global dietary preferences?
Well, I think many people have become aware that animal agriculture has really escorted the virus in two ways. The first is what you mentioned with regard to comorbidities. If a person is an omnivore, they are much more likely to have excess weight, high risk of diabetes and hypertension. And when the virus first emerged in China, it was clear that people with those conditions were much more likely to have a bad course of COVID if they were infected. In other words, a person infected by COVID who had a normal body weight and didn't have diabetes and didn't have hypertension, their survival was really quite high. Those people who had these comorbidities, their survival was much more in doubt. The other way, though, that animal products have contributed to this is one that I think we need to pay more attention to in the future, and that's what is the origin of the virus. The coronavirus, according to the best evidence we have, came into the human populations by way of bats. If people did not have the idea of capturing bats in China and selling them in the market in Wuhan and making them part of their dining experience, the likelihood of that virus transmitting into the human population would be much, much, much lower. The same has been true with other infections, and we've known this for more than 100 years. The 1918 so-called Spanish flu pandemic was a wild bird virus. And if people would get away from the bad habit of deciding that they have to eat birds, we would probably not have had that virus entering human culture. We are now at a point where we are seeing the absolutely predictable event that we predicted and many others did too, which is that we would get new variants of the coronavirus. We are seeing this over and over and again. And in Denmark, they saw it where? On fur farms.
Yeah.
Why? Because the fur workers were infected with COVID. They gave it to the mink. And then as the virus leaps from one species to another, and then it sort of broils in that species for a while and then is transferred back, you see new genetic variants that can differ in transmissibility. They can differ in the risk of harm, their pathogenicity. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And then we saw it in Sweden, we saw it in one country after another. And then of course they're eradicating and burying their mink. Here in the United States, in New York, we have about 80 live animal markets selling chickens and geese and other animals that people can eat. And these are just breeding grounds waiting for someone with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the COVID-19 virus, to come in, give it to the animals, and then it percolates in the animals and comes back to bite us. Dr. Fauci said a year ago that we ought to be getting rid of these live animal markets. Anytime you consolidate animals to try to create some resource for yourself, you're just using them as a viral cauldron. And we ought to have learned the lessons of the past 100 years. We are destroying human culture as we know it by creating breeding grounds for viruses that can infect our families.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a follow-up question. Dr. Bernard, in your opinion, do you think this is the worst pandemic to hit our generation?
Oh, yes. Now, when you compare the figures, we're not yet anywhere near where we were with the 1918 pandemic. But the 1918 pandemic, killer as it was, eventually elicited a certain amount of immunity in people that over the next many years was helpful until the virus, through a process called reassortment, modified to become much more deadly. And we saw it in 1957 and 1968, these terribly deadly outbreaks. And our fear, and I'm sorry to say our prediction, is that that's exactly what we're going to see with coronaviruses, unless we can change our habits. And that means changing how we interact with animals, which is basically leave them alone, so that we don't feel a need to bring them into our lives as food or coats or whatever, because when we do, we carry their viruses along with them. And secondly, we need to tackle our underlying health conditions so that we are more resilient in the face of a virus.
So in other words, while this has been sort of historically the worst, potentially the worst is yet to come, is what you're predicting. There could be a lot worse pandemic around the corner.
Yes, that's certainly possible. Now, history is being rewritten every day. And as the vaccines were escorted in at the end of the last calendar year, we were all hopeful and are still hopeful that they'll be able to dramatically change the course of this. And I think that's true. But if you read the headlines, even the headlines that come out today, there is grave concern that the changing virus with coronavirus will be very much like influenza. And let me be clear. When the vaccines came out, it was a big open question. Would it be like a polio vaccine? You take it once, you're set. You're not going to get polio. Or would it be like the influenza vaccine, where you take it once and you're only set for a matter of months, and you're hoping that it will be active against the particular influenza strain that is out at that time? It's starting to look like the coronavirus vaccines might be in the latter category, where they have to be administered annually. We don't know that that's the case, but that's the concern. And the more that these coronavirus variants emerge, the riskier it is. And so for me as a physician, I just can't contemplate that we would want to be playing this sort of Russian roulette, which we continue to do so. The live animal markets that I mentioned in New York are still there. They're not shut down. The farms that generate new viruses are still operating. And it's just really a matter of time before we'll see more and more variants coming out.
Yeah, and I think, I would like to think that humanity, and we would like to think that humanity's learned its lesson and, adopted a completely new regime in terms of their dietary preferences. But just a month ago, or even a few weeks ago, we had a bird flu outbreak here in India,
Right.
and they culled thousands of ducks and geese and chickens, and there was a ban for a short while of selling chicken and eggs here. I think it's over now, 2-3 weeks later, and people are back to eating chicken and eggs, and like nothing ever happened. So, and that could be a very deadly thing. I mean, if bird flu switches on to transmits to humans, we're in real trouble in terms of morbidity rate. So, but it seems like people seem to shrug things off, and that's I mean, that maybe that's human nature. I don't know, but we're all hopeful that many of us will wake up and adopt a better, cleaner diet. That's good for the planet.
We are allergic to rules in many cases. When a person says maybe you should just not be eating chickens at all, people are a bit afraid of making a pronouncement like that. And a generation ago, it was the same with smoking. We didn't really want to say, you'd be better off just not smoking at all. It sounded a little too punitive, and nobody wanted to do that. So at that time, we used the phrase cut down. You should try to cut down on smoking. We thought, well, that sounds okay. Maybe I can get away with saying that. The problem was that cutting down really didn't lead to much of anything. It led to people coming right back to smoking a pack a day. And that's where we are with meat. People will say, well, I'm trying to cut down. I'm eating a whole lot more vegetarian foods than in the past. That's all certainly good.
Yeah.
But as a doctor, I have to say there's nothing like quitting smoking, and there's nothing like just avoiding the animal products
altogether. So, Dr. Bernard, what prompted you to sort of found the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine? And can sort of any physician around the globe join this committee, or what's the structure there, and what's the sort of agenda for that organization that you founded?
Yes, we'd be eager to have doctors join us, and people who are not physicians will join us as supporters too.
Okay.
We'd be delighted to have you. I started the organization back in 1985. I was fairly new out of training. I was practicing in New York, and I started to discover that although we were pretty good at treating illness and pretty good with diagnosis, we were really not very good with prevention, meaning that a person might have all the indicators of a heart attack coming up. We didn't do anything about it. We didn't do anything to prevent it until the heart attack came into the emergency room door. A person might be at high risk for breast cancer. We weren't really doing much about it until the breast cancer showed up on a mammogram. And I thought, wait a minute, we have steps that we can take to prevent these things, or at least to reduce the risk. And we ought to be arguing for that. Diet is the most important one. And I also wanted to deal with research issues as well. And so I founded the Physicians Committee, and we've grown quite a lot over the years. And we have clinical trials that we do, testing the effects of diet. We have educational programs, and we have lots of programs for physicians and as well as the lay public.
So any physician listening who's sort of keen to sort of get current with some of the research that you've done and others have done in this area, essentially using food as medicine, you would encourage to sort of join and avail themselves of the resources that you provide.
I hope they will join us. Our website is pcrm.org, and
Yes,
we'd be happy to have you. We'd be happy to have you visit us. And we have an annual conference called the International Conference on Nutrition in Medicine. And I hesitate to use the word silver lining, but the pandemic has caused us to transform the conference from a live event to a Zoom event. But that means that our friends in India, our friends in China, our friends in Europe, our friends in Africa can easily join us at the International Conference on Nutrition and Medicine. It's an annual event, and this year it will be in July, and I hope that people from all over the world will join in.
Great. We have a question, I think, Karthika.
Yes, Dr. Bernard from Abbas, thanks for joining us today. Hi, Dr. B. Thanks for all your phenomenal work. I wanted to know how one should respond to studies that suggest that fish intake is associated with higher cognitive function. He says this seems to come up for him all the time.
Yes. Well, fish do contain DHA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid that the brain needs. However, when you look at people who don't eat fish and in fact don't eat animal products at all, their the cognitive decline of people who avoid animal products is much slower than the more rapid cognitive decline of meat eaters. So avoiding fish and avoiding meat and so forth is actually fine and a very good choice. But that raises the question, where are you getting your DHA? And the answer is that plants have precursors to it called ALA, or alpha linolenic acid, that your body will transform into DHA. Some people are impatient and they don't want to wait for that process of conversion of ALA to DHA. And they take DHA pills, which you'll find at health food stores, and you'll find them online. And you can take them if you want. Some of them are fish derived, others are totally vegan, but their efficacy has not yet been established.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Dr. Bernard. So is there a connection between what we eat and depression and anxiety? Because there are many physicians who talk about like your gut health on your physical and mental well-being. So what are your sort of thoughts on the much talked about hyped microbiome?
Yes, we sort of wandered into this area accidentally. We were working with one of the United States' very large insurance companies and introduced a completely plant-based diet in their workplace because they had a lot of diabetes and weight problems. And what we found was that not only did serving vegan food in the cafeteria and having classes to help people to adopt this diet, not only did that improve body weight and help diabetes to get better, but to our surprise, we noticed that depression seemed to remit and anxiety seemed to get better and job absenteeism went down. So we started digging into the literature to try to figure out what's going on, and other studies have shown much the same thing. And there are a variety of explanations as to why a plant-based diet could help. And the one that you described is one, which is that it changes the gut microbiome, which in turn influences brain function. And the other big theory is that the diet is an anti-inflammatory diet. So it causes the body to produce fewer inflammatory chemicals that in turn can affect the brain. We're not too sure which of these is the bigger issue, but it does seem that when people are struggling with depression, in addition to whatever medical care they are taking advantage of, they should also follow as healthful a lifestyle as possible, and that means healthy diet, lace up your sneakers, get your heart pumping with some regular exercise, hopefully do it in the company of others, and depression seems to remit for many people.
It's just
sorry, I have a follow-up question.
Me too. Go ahead.
Yeah, lots of my friends who are obviously not vegan watch Forks Over Knives and What the Health and stuff like that. And one of the biggest things they tell me is, Kathy, after I watch it, it sounds like I can't eat anything. So what can they eat, Dr. Bernard?
If a person is a vegan, there's nothing to eat?
No. If they're non-vegans, if they're meat eaters, they watch these documentaries and they say, sounds like there's nothing I can eat. These documentaries confuse me. I don't know what I'm supposed to eat and what I'm not supposed to eat.
Yes. Okay. Well, the rules are pretty simple. There are 4 food groups that are sort of our basic ingredients, if I can put it that way. And they're vegetables and fruits and whole grains and legumes. And by legumes, I just mean beans and peas and lentils. Now, those are the raw ingredients, and what they will transform into is, let's say I pick rice as my grain, and I can cook it up in many different ways. And how many varieties of rice are there? There are many, many, many. And then I might add a legume like lentils, which I can prepare. And I'm a little embarrassed to be talking to my Indian friends about how to prepare lentils and rice, because they have so much expertise, far more than I do, in how to take this very simple raw material and turn it into something that is an absolute jewel. And they will take spinach and turn that into a wonderful dish, and they will take fruits and make wonderful dishes out of them as well. And as long as we're careful, we don't really need to be adding the dairy products to it. You can have a fabulous dish with spinach and potatoes and lentils and so forth without adding dairy products and without oiling it up in any way. And you have such wonderful choices. And I have to confess that when I was a child growing up, I grew up in North Dakota, and I had the idea that a healthy diet, or frankly, just our plate in general, it had meat, some vegetable, and a potato, and that was all we ever ate. And once I went to a completely plant-based diet, it was as if the world of culinary treasures opened up to me. And I don't mean just wonderful traditional Indian cuisine with wonderful foods, but also foods, say, from Thailand and Vietnam and from China and from Mexico and from Italy, where maybe in Italy it might be noodles with a tomato sauce and a little bit of picante sauce and so forth. In Mexico, it might be beans and tortillas, but the world of choices is vast and a delight for the palate, but also your body's pretty glad too.
So it's interesting that you recommend rice. I know that I meet a lot of North Indian diabetologists who say, no, rice is really bad for you. You should eat whole wheat, right? And that if you're a diabetic, and you shouldn't eat any mangoes because mangoes have lots of sugar. So these are some of the sort of the common, dietary advice that diabetics in India get. I mean, I'm astounded, because I think a little YouTubing with you or Dr. Esselstyn or Dr. Colin Campbell will tell them that they are on the wrong side of that nutrition profile there. But it's amazing that those sort of myths around diet still prevail, and that diabetics still get these sort of advice around cutting down on sugar when they should be cutting down on animal fat, is what I understand.
Yes, I think we should jump into our time machine and go back to Japan in 1980. And Westernization had not gone very far at that point. And in other words, there wasn't McDonald's in downtown Tokyo. And the diet was very heavy in rice. And in fact, it was white rice. And the same was true in Osaka, and all around Japan, people ate lots of rice. They were the thinnest, healthiest, longest lived people on the planet. And the rate of diabetes, even in adults over the age of 40, it was about 1 to 5% of the population. So if rice caused diabetes, they should have had a huge amount of it. They didn't. But then when Westernization occurred and rice started to fall, and it was replaced by more meat and cheese and ice cream, diabetes came up. And by 1990, diabetes was 10 or 11 or 12% of the population over the age of 40. So rice is fine. Grains in general are fine. They do have carbohydrate in them, and carbohydrate is actually the natural fuel for your body. In your body, it breaks apart to release natural sugars, glucose, that will enter your cells and power them. To have your body running without glucose is like having your car run without gasoline. It's a challenging thing to do. Your body is designed to run on healthy glucose. That said, I'm not suggesting that people should be having Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper, because those are just added sugars that the body doesn't require.
Karthik, I think we have some questions, right?
Yes, actually, Dr. Bernard, if you don't mind going back to the whole type 2 diabetes discussion, one of our audience members wants to know that he's used intermittent fasting, low sugar food, HIIT, etc. However, once he stopped those, the blood sugar started to go up again. So he really wants to understand what it actually means to reverse type 2 diabetes.
Okay. The term reversal is not a medical term. It's not a scientific term. It simply means that things that were bad are getting better. But in common parlance, what many people view it as is when you go on a healthful diet, your blood sugar starts to come down, your hemoglobin A1C starts to come down. Eventually, if all goes well, it will get down into the level where it's no longer diagnostic of diabetes. And your requirement for medications will diminish, and hopefully you'll be able to eliminate them. All the while, make sure that you're staying under medical care, because it takes time for these things, and some people only go so far. But what I think the question includes is a really important point, that if a person is following a healthy diet and then they go off of it, it's easy to have diabetes come back.
And this healthy diet, as you said, I think he's mentioned HIIT and intermittent fasting, but what you're advocating is a completely plant-based, 100% from plant-based, low-fat diet, correct?
That's right. I would suggest 3 things. Avoid animal products completely. Secondly, keep oils very low. So we favor cooking methods that don't require oil. That sometimes for people requires a little bit of relearning, but it's easy to do. And then the third is choose the healthiest foods that there are. So things like fruits and beans and whole grains, vegetables are really healthful foods, as opposed to the snacks that the corner convenience store might put up right next to the cash register.
Okay. Okay. And this includes also no dairy, right? So there's absolutely no dairy.
Yes. We avoid dairy products. And I know that many people find that to be a challenge, but keep in mind that Mother Nature made cow's milk for the calf and not for us. We can kick and scream as much as we want to, but Mother Nature really didn't have us in mind when cow's milk was is produced. And at the risk of going further with this, I think the most respectful thing that we can do for ourselves, for our children, for the animals themselves, and for our planet is to treat the animals with respect, allow them to keep their products and not take them from them.
Ditto. Karthika?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting you touched upon the point of infants and feeding infants, Dr. Bernard. Are you suggesting that from infancy that we should be vegan?
I'm going further. From conception, we should be vegan.
So pregnant mothers.
Meaning
vegan mothers.
When a woman is expecting, if she follows a healthy plant-based diet, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans, and she gets appropriate medical monitoring, she should be taking her prenatal vitamins, including B12. But that kind of diet is associated with a better course of pregnancy. And when the child is born, hopefully the child will be breastfed. And mom will continue to follow this healthy diet, and she'll continue to take her vitamin supplements so that we're making sure to have vitamin B12, which is essential. This is not optional. It's really important. And then eventually the child will start to have solid foods. And that should not be chicken wings, and it doesn't have to be yogurt. It can be the same foods, fruits, eventually rice and other grains, eventually beans, and vegetables will all come in. And the rules for children are the same as rules for adults. Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, don't forget your vitamin B12.
And that's what you meant by inheriting recipes.
The children who are raised on a healthy plant-based diet, they've received the greatest gift that their parents could ever give them. You know, and it sometimes breaks my heart. Here in the US especially, we see families who really endeavor to try to create a good physical space for their children. They are concerned about the schools they go to. They worry about the moral values their children grow up with. And they pay a great deal of attention to these things. But very often their children grow up with diets. They're going to cause them to be sick and in many ways very unhappy and very limited, starting quite early in their adulthood. And unfortunately, these children, sometimes at age 14, 15, 16, are developing prediabetes and hypertension. And they've got excess weight, and their parents will wag their fingers at them saying, you know, you're spending too much time on your phone and on your computer. You should go out and exercise. That's your problem. It's your fault that you're gaining weight. And I have to say, limiting screen time is a good idea, but that has nothing to do with the reason why these kids are in bad shape. It has to do with the foods that they're dosing themselves with 3 times a day.
Yeah.
We have an audience question come in from Sabira. She wants to know whether in this diet that you're prescribing, Dr. Bernard, nuts and nut oils are included.
Nuts have some healthfulness that can be recommended. They have vitamin E in them. The problem is that nuts, particularly when you roast them and salt them and season them, they rapidly become addictive. And there are companies that will sell you nuts with all the shells all removed. And so it's very, very easy to indulge in huge amounts of them. And as a person does that, they discover their weight loss grinds to a halt and their diabetes isn't getting better very fast. So if a person is trying to lose weight, or if you have diabetes that you're trying to reverse, I would suggest leaving the nuts aside and leaving oils aside, because what we're trying to do is to really get the oil out of our diet. In fact, let me just take a minute and describe this a little bit, because I didn't go into this much earlier, and I probably should. Diabetes starts out with foods that you're eating have a lot of fat in them. If you're a meat eater, it's animal fat. If you're eating a lot of French fries and salad oils, you're getting a lot of maybe vegetable grease from the fryer. That fat that you're eating gets into the muscle cells. It gets into your liver cells. When that happens, the cells are filled with fat, and it causes insulin resistance. What that means is that your insulin hormone can't get the sugar into the cell. The cell is filled with fat. What's the answer? A vegan diet doesn't have any animal fat in it at all. And if I keep the oils low, keep the nuts low, there's not much of any kind of fat. The fat then starts to dissipate from the muscle and liver cells. The insulin resistance starts to go away. The sugar can then get into the cell, and your blood sugar falls, and the diabetes gets better and better and better. And for some people, it eventually goes away. So that's why we're really encouraging people to get away from those fatty foods. That means get away from animal products. But with regard to nuts and seeds, if you are trying to reverse diabetes, I would set those aside as well. For healthy, skinny people who don't have diabetes, maybe a little small handful is okay. Don't let it hit your fingers, just in the palm of your hand, and then crumble it up and put it on your morning porridge. Don't eat it as a snack, just use it as a flavoring, and then you can be okay.
Thanks, doctor.
So when you say a little bit of oil, are we talking a tablespoon? Are we a day? We're talking teaspoon a day, a spritz a day?
Oh, well, I guess what I was trying to say is maybe a little bit of nuts, like a tablespoon full of nuts, something like that. If you're using oils, I would encourage you to get a good nonstick pan and a steamer and learn how to use that, and as opposed to adding oils to your foods.
Okay. So just, I mean, you're talking about completely not having them in oil. Okay.
Yeah. Once you've learned different ways of creating foods, you discover that bottle of olive oil that your friend brought over 18 months ago is still sitting there, and you haven't opened it up at all because you found other ways of cooking. And the other thing that happens, I have to say, your tastes start to change. And people who, I have to say, my mother kind of taught me this. When I was about 12 or 13, my mother came into the house and she said, "That's it, everybody. We're not having whole milk anymore." She meant full fat milk. She said, "We're not going to have it. We're going to now have only skim milk from now on," which I guess a person might refer to as toned milk, meaning you take the fat out of it. And so she poured us a glass. And I thought it was terrible. It just didn't taste right at all. But as time went on, we got used to the taste of this non-fat milk. And then one day she didn't have any. So she went to the store and got whole milk. And we couldn't drink it anymore because it tasted all fatty and gross. And that taught me a lesson. I'm not saying that drinking milk is a particularly good idea. Frankly, I think you're better off without it. You're better off with soy milk or almond milk. But that experience taught me that our taste for fats is just sort of a temporary habit that can be changed. When you get away from fatty foods, you tend to prefer the low-fat foods. And so then when somebody tries to put fat back in, you don't want it anymore. So it is a little process of habituation. But when you get away from fats, you end up being quite glad that you've done it, and your taste buds are glad too.
Yeah, I can relate to that. When I went vegan 4 years ago, I mean, I thought I could never sort of give up eggs and meat and everything else. And now when I go to the meat section, I have to literally close my nose. I can't believe I did that stuff.
Right.
So
it's like quitting smoking or something like that. If not that you were ever a smoker, but a person who was, they can't imagine not having their cigarette. After they've been a non-smoker for about 6 weeks, somebody comes near them with a cigarette and they say, "Get away from me. I don't want that all over my shirt and everything." So your tastes will change, and what dictates we want today, what we had yesterday. So we can reset our preferences very, very easily.
Dr. Bernard, I think we've clearly, you can potentially reverse your diabetes significantly or eliminate it completely with this diet. But I'm to understand that a plant-based, whole food plant-based diet not only can help you with diabetes, but as you mentioned, things like thyroidism, but also a whole bunch of other chronic ailments. Am I right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. One of the things that we're exploring right now is menopausal issues. And when I wrote Your Body in Balance, I was discovering something that just blew me away. And that is, instead of the old model, which is I eat a bad food and I get a disease, I eat cholesterol, so I get a heart attack, I started to realize that hormones control every aspect of our physical functioning. And if we can choose foods that control our hormones, we've got real power. So we started looking at sex hormones, estrogens in women, testosterone in men, discovering that we can change the levels of these hormones up or down. And that gave us the ability to reduce menstrual cramps in young women, endometriosis and other causes of infertility. And then when women are going through menopause and they might have hot flashes or other symptoms, we have been discovering that we can change that. The current regimen that we're testing now for hot flashes avoids animal products completely, no animal products, just like a diabetes diet. It keeps oils extremely low, but it also adds soybeans, and we're using about a half a cup of soybeans every day. That's about maybe 240 grams, something like that, of cooked soybeans. And many women are just discovering that it has a very potent effect on their hot flashes. We need more research, and we're conducting that now. But it's been really quite interesting to see these hormonal shifts can be changed very rapidly based on food choices. Who would have thought it?
Wow. Because I think I remember Dr. Esselstyn, who said like 80 or 85% of chronic diseases are fixed by this whole food plant-based diet.
In our clinic, when people come in, most people have some weight they'd like to lose. Their blood pressure and cholesterol are higher than they'd like to be. And we know that those are things that are very readily addressable by a diet change.
Wow.
Sorry, I've just had one audience member message me privately because she has a medical issue. So basically what she's saying is that she's done a ferritin test, and the doctor say her blood protein is low, and they're now forcing her to eat red meat, and whether that's required or what can she do?
Okay, ferritin is a stored form of iron. And if she's low in iron, we want to try to figure out why. Her doctor will be hopefully doing this. The doctor's first concern is she losing blood on a regular basis? Obviously, women during their reproductive years will have some blood loss each month. Later on in life, if a person is running low in ferritin, doctors will look for digestive issues that might be leading to the loss of iron. If all of those check out and there's no problem there at all, then the question is it an iron deficiency that's going on? If so, you want to do two things. You want to make sure you have iron in your diet. Red meat is one source, but it's the worst source because it has cholesterol and animal fat along with it. The animals that you took it from were probably vegans anyway, and they were getting iron without meat. So why do you need meat for iron? What you can do instead is do what the animals did. The animals got their iron. Iron is an element. It's in the earth, and it goes through the roots of grass or other vegetables, and it gets into their leaves. And so as a cow or a bullock is eating grass, they get the iron. So hopefully you're not eating grass, but if you're eating your broccoli or kale or collards or other green vegetables, you get huge amounts of iron. The second thing, in addition to having iron-rich foods, is avoid milk, avoid dairy. It will cut iron absorption by about 50%. So you want to avoid that as well.
Wow, great advice. So, Dr. Bernard, you talked a little bit about depression and anxiety and the impacts of diet on that. Is there any sort of validity to the idea that at slaughter, obviously an animal is suffering a lot of anxiety, is probably depressed, all kinds of hormones are firing in that body just prior to slaughter. Are we, by eating that meat, sort of ingesting some of those stress hormones ourselves when we have a meat diet?
Some people have speculated that may be the case. I don't know if it is in fact the case or not. But I do have to say, in my own life, I've used some of these experiences as motivators for me and for other people. And if you don't mind, I might just mention that a little bit.
Please.
When I was a kid, I grew up in North Dakota, as I mentioned. And my father grew up raising cattle, as did his father and his father and his father. And my father didn't like it. He got out of that business and he went to medical school, and he was the local diabetes expert for Fargo, North Dakota. But we still ate like we were in the cattle business. And one day my father's brother drove a whole truckload of cattle, a couple of truckloads actually, to East St. Louis to the stockyards. And as they came off the truck, you could see something. They were visibly scared and nervous. And the way they were being pushed and conveyed along in this process that led towards sale and slaughter was creating tremendous anxiety in them. And I could see in the process of transport, some of them will break their legs and fall down or be trampled by others. And it was almost as if slaughter was, in some ways, a relief of all of the trauma that had gone into it. And it was true. It really had quite an impact on me. And then when I visited a dairy farm, where you think, oh, the cows are happy and they're giving away milk, I discovered that the cows are impregnated by a process of artificial insemination that is really grotesque when you see the farm workers do this to the cow. They chain the cow up and they do all kinds of things to the backside of her body that I don't want to tell you about, but you're not gonna have an appetite to eat after you see this. And then when the cow gives birth, her baby, which she bonds to very strongly, she's licking her awkward little baby who's trying to stand up. There's nothing cuter than a newborn calf, I have to tell you. But then along comes the farm worker with a wheelbarrow, and he picks up the calf and puts the calf in the wheelbarrow and starts walking away. And there is no bond stronger in nature than that between a mother and her infant. And she follows, and she's saying as best she can, "That's my baby." And then a gate is slammed in her face, and the male calf will be turned into veal very quickly, and the female calf will be raised in complete isolation until she is ready to be artificially inseminated. And no one likes to talk about these things. They like to pretend that cows gladly give us milk. They don't want to pretend, they don't want to let you know that they're artificially inseminated every year, that their calves are taken away, that we find ways to let the calves die, sometimes without taking responsibility for it ourselves, because we sold the calf to someone else. Other things. I don't mean to suggest that people need to feel guilty about these things, but what I do feel is that we should allow these things to motivate us, and to realize that there are ways to be respectful to your body, respectful to your children, and respectful to the animals. And there are ways to treat them with respect and to leave their reproduction alone. I know that people protest when we talk about these things, and they rationalize and make all kinds of arguments. Those arguments hold no water. We are designed for better than this.
I think that's a really good point that you make. And I think, living in India, the cow is held to be a sacred animal, but what Indians very myopically don't realize is that India is the largest producer and consumer of dairy in the world. There are 327 million bovine who are also fed by the same system that feeds 1.3 billion people. So there's, all of that grain that goes to the livestock. And I think if you add all the livestock, it's 527 or 30 million livestock in India. So in addition to 1.3 billion human beings, the Indian agricultural system feeds over 500 million animals as well. The other thing, that fact that people don't realize is, if Google, is that India is also one of the largest producers or exporters of beef in the world, and one of the largest exporters of leather in the world. So those two facts are sort of concealed beneath people. And so while, yes, the cow is venerated, the byproducts of the dairy industry, which is meat and leather, are conveniently sort of forgotten. And I'm glad you shared that story with us.
And I think the young generation can kind of forgive itself. So many of my young Indian friends, will say, well, a vegetarian diet was sort of the quaint habit of my grandparents, but I'm modern. I wear Levi's jeans. I go to the movies. I eat at Pizza Hut, and I'm a non-vegetarian. I get that, but hopefully as we reflect on things a little bit, we'll realize that sometimes our grandparents had some pretty good ideas, and the idea of not eating a chicken wing was a really good idea. But our grandparents weren't perfect either. They might have had a taste for yogurt, which their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents might not have done. And so if we go back a little bit further, we realize that those wonderful age-old Indian treasures that come from plants are a wonderful legacy to be remembered. And some of these Western influences that I'm going to blame on Chicago and New York and Pittsburgh, some of them might be good to be kind of pushed out of our consciousness a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's especially true that when 1 in 6 diabetics in the world are Indian now. So that's the statistics from 2016. So
yes,
that number is growing.
That's all true. But I have to say, I am so happy to see how things are changing now. I think my first trip to India was in the 1980s. And at that time, people were not talking about plant-based diets very much. And of course, we still had leprosy and all kinds of things. You look at how things have changed now. There are so many doctors in India, just like everywhere else.
Yes.
Be able to learn what vegan means. Put this to use. Think about the substitutes for dairy and meat. The world is changing. The enthusiasm for a healthy, completely plant-based diet is bigger every single year. That's great for India. But I also have to say that here in the United States, we've been promoting Westernization in India. In the United States, we are starting to learn Easternization, where we can learn of the wonderful things that India has had to teach us. By that, I don't mean just culinary-wise, from wonderful Indian foods, but also the concept of ahimsa, and the idea that we can live in a much better way, and we can turn that over to our children, and they can be the healthiest generation we have ever had.
Yeah, that's true. And plant-based diets and health and foods and options are ever increasing here. So it is a cause for great optimism, in fact. So and actually, it's really easy to be vegan here if you pay attention. There's 30 different ways of making dal here, all of them different, all of them delicious. So I mean, hey, if you want to eat legumes, this is the place to be. So
I'll be right here.
Yeah. So Karthik, any more last questions before we let off?
I have one. It's quite a heavy one. Sorry about that, Dr. Bernard. So we were going through, obviously, your website, and we noticed that you've done a pilot study on chronic diabetic neuropathy pain. Could you share some of the preliminary findings from that study, please?
Oh, this was so important. There are some people who have diabetes that has been troubling them for many years. And as that happens, one of the conditions that occurs is neuropathy, where the nerves are being attacked. You get numbness and often pain in the feet and other symptoms as well. And so we brought in a large group of people who had diabetic neuropathy. And what we were able to show is the same dietary intervention, getting away from animal products and oils. It caused the nerve function to improve. Pain diminished, and objective tests of nerve function, where we measure the galvanic skin response in the hands and the feet, it improved significantly. And you could see this really quite rapidly. So everyone has different effects, but if a person has diabetic neuropathy, I would strongly encourage them to go to this approach, particularly since the medical treatments for it are really not particularly powerful. The medications for neuropathy are really quite weak, but the diet is a great, great, great way to go.
Thank you so much. Well, that's also positive news for those of you.
Yes, very, very much so.
Yes, and I know you've written a cookbook with Indian recipes, I understand, as well on your diet for reversing diabetes, correct?
Well, I want to say that my good friends within the Indian subcontinent are greatly surpassing my culinary ability and are releasing so many resources for people with diabetes and for people without it. And I would really shine a spotlight on what they've done. Okay,
great. So I was going to put that as a resource potentially on our on our copy of this video so that people could go to it if they require. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard, for gracing our show and for such a treasure trove of information around disease prevention as well as cure. Thank you so much for all of the information and for all the great work you do. And I would encourage any physicians watching to be a part of your committee and join the global conclave that's happening in July.
Well, thank you very much. And let me also say I'm so grateful to you for all that you have done, because you reach many, many people, you inform them and you inspire them. And that information is saving their lives. They in turn cannot resist over the dinner table telling somebody else about what they have heard on one of your programs. And that in turn is saving more lives. You'll never know how many lives you're saving, but I guarantee many, many, many. And I really appreciate all that you have done.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.